Summary: years after a tragic accident claimed the life of a student during a secretive occult club meeting, a new teacher at Crestwood High School discovers that the club never really disbanded. They just learned how to wait. Now, as the anniversary approaches, the school's dark past is bleeding into the present, and the final bell is tolling for a ritual that was never completed. The fluorescent lights of room 304 buzzed with a low, persistent hum, a sound that seemed to bore directly into Elias Thorne's skull. He was the newest addition to Crestwood High School's faculty, taking over a history curriculum that had been abruptly abandoned mid-semester by his predecessor, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who had taken an indefinite leave of absence, for reasons the administration refused to elaborate on. Elias was a practical man, grounded in dates and facts, but even he couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere of the classroom. It wasn't just the outdated decor or the scuffed linoleum floor. It was a heavy, stagnant air, like the room was holding its breath. It started with small things, a chill that lingered near the back row, no matter how high the thermostat was set, papers shuffling when no one was near the desk. And then there was the locked cabinet in the corner, a hulking metal monstrosity that Abernathy had apparently insisted on keeping. The key was nowhere to be found. Elias tried to ignore the subtle wrongness of his new environment, focusing instead on his students. They were a typical mix of apathetic teenagers, save for one, a quiet, intensely observant girl named Lily. She sat in the very back row, the epicenter of the unnatural cold, and watched him with eyes that seemed too old for her face. She never spoke in class, never turned in assignments, but her presence was a constant weight in the room. One afternoon, long after the final bell had rung and the halls had emptied, Elias decided it was time to deal with the cabinet. He fetched a crowbar from the janitor's closet, determined to reclaim his classroom. The metal groaned in protest as he pried the doors apart, the sound echoing loudly in the silent school. Inside, there were no textbooks or teaching supplies. Instead, the shelves were lined with leather-bound journals, their covers cracked and peeling. In the center sat a wooden box, intricately carved with symbols Elias didn't recognize. He reached for a journal, the leather cool to the touch. The handwriting inside was frantic, cramped. It was Abernathy's. They didn't stop. They just learned how to hide. Elias turned the pages, a growing sense of unease settling in his stomach. Abernathy had documented the history of a club, an unsanctioned group that called themselves the Seekers. They weren't studying history. They were trying to summon it. The journals detailed rituals, incantations, and a growing obsession with a local legend about a doorway that could be opened with the right combination of words and blood. The entries grew more erratic, detailing a specific date, November 14th, the anniversary. Elias froze. Tomorrow was November 14th. He kept reading. Abernathy believed that a tragedy 20 years ago, the sudden, unexplained death of a student named Sarah, wasn't an accident. It was a failed ritual, and he believed the current members of the Seekers were trying to finish it. Elias slammed the journal shut. This was madness, a teacher's delusion. But the cold in the room felt sharper now, biting through his sweater. He looked at the carved wooden box. He shouldn't open it. He knew he shouldn't, but the impulse was overwhelming. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a silver bell. It was tarnished, the metal etched with the same strange symbols as the box. As he touched it, a shock of cold shot up his arm, and for a fleeting second he heard a voice, a whisper, desperate and terrified. "Don't let them ring it." Elias dropped the bell, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound of it hitting the metal shelf was deafening. He backed away from the cabinet, his breath misting in the suddenly freezing air. He needed to leave. Now. He gathered his things, his hands shaking. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back at the empty classroom. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching towards the open cabinet. He flipped the light switch, plunging the room into darkness, and hurried down the hallway. The school was unnervingly quiet. The locker doors, usually a cacophony of slamming metal, stood silent. Elias' footsteps echoed too loudly. He just wanted to get to his car, to get away from the oppressive weight of Crestwood High. But as he passed the library, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. A low, rhythmic chanting. It was coming from inside. Against his better judgment, Elias crept towards the library doors. They were slightly ajar. He peered through the gap. The room was illuminated by the flickering light of dozens of candles. In the center, sitting in a circle, were 5 students. And at the head of the circle was Lily. They were holding hands, their voices rising and falling in an unnatural cadence. Elias couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. It was a summoning. In front of Lily sat the wooden box from Abernathy's cabinet. Panic surged through Elias. He had to stop this. He pushed the doors open, the hinges squealing in protest. The chanting abruptly stopped. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at him. They were blank, devoid of any normal teenage expression. "What are you doing?" Elias demanded, his voice trembling. "Stop this right now." Lily tilted her head, a slow, unnatural smile spreading across her face. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Thorne. You're interrupting." "This isn't a game, Lily. Abernathy." "Mr. Abernathy was weak," she interrupted, her voice echoing strangely in the cavernous room. "He didn't understand. He thought he could lock it away. But the past doesn't stay buried, Mr. Thorne. It just waits." She reached out and opened the box. The silver bell gleamed in the candlelight. "Don't touch that," Elias warned, taking a step forward. The temperature in the room plummeted. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The shadows seemed to detach themselves, coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes that writhed and twisted in the darkness. "Sarah has been waiting a long time," Lily whispered, her eyes fixed on the bell. "The circle must be completed." Elias lunged towards her, desperate to snatch the bell away. But an invisible force slammed into him, throwing him backward. He hit a bookshelf hard, the breath knocked out of him. He struggled to rise, his vision swimming. The shadows were growing denser, solidifying. They weren't just shapes anymore, they were forms. Grotesque, elongated figures that pulsed with dark energy. Lily picked up the bell. "No," Elias croaked, pushing himself up. She raised the bell and brought it down sharply. "Ring." The sound was not that of a typical bell. It was a hollow, echoing tone that seemed to vibrate in Elias' teeth. It was the sound of a heavy door swinging open on rusted hinges. The candles blew out instantly, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The temperature dropped further, the cold burning Elias' skin. The silence that followed the ring was absolute, deafening. Then a new sound began, a wet, tearing noise, like something heavy dragging itself across the floor. "Sarah," Lily whispered in the darkness, her voice trembling now, not with reverence but with terror. The dragging sound grew closer. Elias fumbled in his pocket for his phone, desperate for a light. His fingers brushed against the cold metal casing. He pulled it out and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the center of the circle. Lily and the other students were gone. In their place stood a figure. It was vaguely human, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at unnatural angles. It was draped in what looked like a rotting school uniform, the fabric clinging to its skeletal frame. It turned its head slowly toward Elias. Where its face should have been, there was only a gaping, ragged hole from which a thick, black substance oozed. Elias couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The primal fear paralyzing him was absolute. The entity let out a sound, a cross between a sob and a shriek, and lunged. Elias scrambled backward, his phone slipping from his grasp. The flashlight beam spun crazily across the ceiling before settling on the floor, illuminating the entity's twisted legs as it scrambled towards him with terrifying speed. He didn't think, he just ran. He scrambled to his feet and bolted for the doors, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind him. He burst out of the library and into the hallway, his boots slipping on the polished floor. He didn't look back. He ran down the corridor, the fluorescent lights flickering wildly, casting strobe-like flashes of illumination. The shadows seemed to be reaching for him, the very walls of the school closing in. He reached the front entrance, slamming his body against the heavy glass doors. They didn't budge. He pushed frantically, but they were locked tight. He turned, his chest heaving. The hallway was empty. The flickering lights had steadied. The silence had returned. But the cold remained. Elias backed away from the doors, his eyes scanning the shadows. He was trapped. The school had become a cage, and he was locked inside with whatever that thing was. He needed a weapon. He needed a way out. He remembered the crowbar he had left in room 304. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one he had. He crept back down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a gunshot. He reached the stairwell and began to ascend, his grip tight on the railing. As he reached the second floor, he heard it again. The dragging sound. It was coming from above him. He froze. The entity was on the third floor, near his classroom. He had to get the crowbar. He continued his ascent, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate. He reached the third floor landing and peered down the hallway. It was dark, the overhead lights completely dead. The only illumination came from the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. The dragging sound was coming from room 304. Elias pressed himself against the wall and inched towards the classroom. He reached the doorway and risked a glance inside. The entity was there. It was hunched over Abernathy's cabinet, its long, twisted fingers rifling through the journals. The crowbar was lying on the floor, just a few feet inside the door. Elias took a deep breath. He had one chance. He darted into the room, snatching the crowbar from the floor. The entity whipped around, its gaping maw letting out a horrific screech. It lunged, its skeletal hands reaching for him. Elias swung the crowbar with all his might. The heavy iron connected with the entity's side, a sickening crunch echoing in the room. The entity shrieked and recoiled, its form flickering like a bad television signal. Elias didn't wait. He turned and bolted, sprinting down the hallway. He didn't head for the stairs. He headed for the fire escape at the end of the corridor. He hit the crash bar, and the heavy metal door flew open. He burst out into the cold night air, the sudden rush of oxygen burning his lungs. He scrambled down the metal stairs, his feet clanging loudly against the grating. He hit the ground and kept running across the parking lot towards his car. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking violently. He managed to unlock the door, throw himself inside, and lock it behind him. He started the engine, the roar of it the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He threw the car into reverse, tires squealing against the asphalt, and sped out of the parking lot. He didn't stop driving until he was miles away, the lights of Crestwood High a distant memory. He pulled over on the side of the road, his entire body trembling. He rested his head against the steering wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had escaped. He was alive. But as his heart rate began to slow, a sudden realization struck him. He looked down at his hands, still gripping the steering wheel. They were covered in a thick, black substance, the same substance that had oozed from the entity's face. The cold wasn't just in the school. It was inside him. And from the back seat, in the darkness, he heard a sound. A hollow, echoing tone. Ring. Detention is forever. What would you do if the history you were teaching tried to kill you? Horror story, occult, high school horror. Some clubs never disband, they just learn how to wait in the dark. Don't ring the bell. Scary story creepypasta fiction. The past doesn't stay buried, it just waits for the final bell. Read The Final Bell if you dare. Horror fiction, supernatural, occult horror.